Good afternoon. Lovely. Good afternoon. I'm Homi Bhabha, and I'm delighted to be introducing and moderating this panel. A panel on Bombay, and I'm delighted to be introducing you to what I would have called the Bombay boys, but Liza, where are you? Liza, well, Liza completely spoiled that, but then I thought about it, and I can introduce you all in the completely gender-neutral style in America as the Bombay guys. You'll sign up to that. So, welcome to the panel of the Bombay guys. I just want to start by thanking Moisin, to rhyme with poison. Moisin and Rahul for setting up this wonderful event. I want to thank Arjun for being the kinetic force, and I want to thank our audience. As I say at the Humanities Center, which is my home, without the audience, we are nothing. And that is absolutely true. And you come out on the weekends, you come out in the afternoons, you come out in the evenings, you come out all across Harvard, and without you, we would be able to do nothing. And with you, we can raise funds. So fun and funds, that's what we're about. Fun and funds. At the Humanities Center and at the GSD2, it's all about fun and fun. So the more you turn up, the more fun, the more funds. That's the cycle we want to keep going. I want to thank Mohsen for his generosity. I remember many, many years ago when his hair was even thicker than it is and I had some to boast of. He called me in London. At that time, he was the director of graduate studies and said he was doing a conference on some, incredibly erotic topic like urbanism in the third world, and asked me if I would come and speak. And I think this is the first time that prudence got the better of my vanity, because I said, I know nothing about this subject. He said, no, you do, you can, you will, etc. And in fact, I was a terrible spoiled sport, and I didn't. I said, I really don't know anything. I was terrified of being exposed. Because as I have learned to my cost, that the other side of interdisciplinarity is ignorance. And I have had a fair share of both, and have performed both in my life. So I sometimes want to now protect myself from the latter. But this raises a larger issue, and I won't labor the point, that quite apart from the vision of leaders and directors, quite apart from students, architecture itself seems to me to be a very generous art. And I was thinking about this on the way here. And the simple phrase that it does, architecture makes space, but it also introduces new kind of times, new forms of cultural time. And I think that's extremely important. It seems to me, of course, that you can see how the spaces made by architecture are not only themselves aesthetic, as well as profoundly technological feats of engineering, chemistry, physics, topology, a whole range of things. But it's also the way in which architecture has become hospitable to art. So there's certain kind of art that fits in certain kinds of places. You can, of course, mix it up a bit. But gardens, and then sculpture gardens. So it creates the space for the other arts. And it creates a very generous space for the other arts. And this is not something that is often appreciated, except when it doesn't work. X is building is really no good for the X's museum is no good for the work put in it. But I think there's a wider question there about the generosity of the discipline. And I think it's a very generous discipline because there is this kind of, I don't like the word performative, but there is this kind of porosity that architecture has, in which it includes the other arts, it makes the mise en scène for other arts, it opens up the whole issue of landscape and so on. So I think it has that porosity. But it also has a very useful metaphoricity. And by metaphoricity, I don't simply mean some analogical embellishment. I mean that it gives us ways of thinking in an interdisciplinary way. It gives us concepts. It gives us concepts in the shape of metaphors. And if you think just a very, very modest, literally back of the envelope while I was trying to park the car list, if you think about it, I was thinking about Freud. The very spaces of domesticity make certain kinds of psychic relations possible or not possible. The maid listening to the parents talking about the child from just behind the pantry door. I mean, in many of the primal narratives in psychoanalysis, you will find how incredibly important the disposition of space is. And of course, at a no less sexually charged space, but a more recent occurrence. You remember the finely architectural defense of Clinton, that he was never alone in this room with Jennifer, what was her name? Monica Lewinsky. He was never alone with Monica Lewinsky. Jennifer. Yeah. Well, without the hotel, without the invention of the hotel room, Jennifer Flowers would not have happened. If this was an old-fashioned tabard inn, you know, it might have been somewhat more difficult. But think of his defense, serious defense. I was never alone because there was a long corridor and a couple of anterooms separating me and Monica from my assistant, and the doors were always open. But to move from the body to the theoretical, if you think of Althusser's concept, his prime concept of the differences between the ideological state apparatus and the coercive state apparatus, the entire theory is elaborated. One, on the city street, Althusser's notion that coercive state apparatuses work because, like the policeman who says, hey, you, and then you turn around and address the state, but there's a kind of unconscious oral performance, again, performed on the street. But the theory of ideology and the infrastructure is entirely worked out architecturally. Fanon, all the major encounters or many of the major encounters, let me not overstate it, in black skin, white masks are actually worked out in an urban environment, emphasizing the urbanity of the confrontation of colonial peoples and their masters. And of course, Foucault, panopticism, the prison, the whole nature of the subjectification of space, and that then not stopping there, but allowing us in that fine essay of his on other spaces to take the architectural, the urban space, even the non-territorial space and the colonized space into a whole history of thinking about social relations in our time. So the porosity of architecture on the one hand, its generosity to actually displaying the arts, creating space for the arts, and on the other, its interdisciplinarity, its ability to be hospitable and to be a concept metaphor, the porosity and the metaphoricity. And I think this is why, for me, some of the shrewdest comments, and I plan to write something about this for the next generous invitation I have at the GSD, is the way in which Wittgenstein uses analogically the notion of architecture. You know, only one, architecture like philosophy is about thought, but it invites us to make a gesture. And then, of course, that's connected with his notion of what gesture is. And I was actually just this morning trying to make a little genealogy of his use of the word gesture. And gesture is very much about the introduction of the bodily space into a built space and a kind of to and fro, so that nothing in this space is either from the design point of view or indeed from the technological point of view ever given for one and the same time. It's a completely interactive process even after the physical space is built. So it's this notion of interaction which I think also then allows us to think about other forms of architecture or architectural practice like conservation and preservation, which are part of this, you know, this dialogic relationship that Wittgenstein mentions. I think I will I haven't been asked to speak. I was excluded. So I had to make my own time to you know, make my own rights to speak for myself. You know, we the marginalized have to do this again and again, and whenever we can in interstitial spaces, we have to get ourselves there. But I just want to read you something which has been very important for me in discussions of this kind before I introduce the speakers for this panel. I read this in the context of Bombay because I think it says something about the architecture in societies which were at one stage belated, seen to be belated societies. Progress hadn't come there, modernity hadn't come, and then once they were recognized as being belated, they became burdened with all kinds of symbolic structures and Gothic presences and municipal buildings and notions of what the square should be and what the center should be. And so they became both belated and overburdened and overwritten. This is Wittgenstein in 1930. It is all one to me whether or not the typical Western scientist understands or appreciates my work, since he will not in any case understand the spirit in which I write. One of the great ironic statements ever made about the history of philosophy. Our civilization is characterized by the word progress. Progress is its form, rather than making progress being one of its features, that aspectival idea. Typically, it constructs. It is occupied with building an ever more complicated structure, and even clarity is sought only as a means to this end, not as an end in itself. For me, on the contrary, clarity, perspicuity are valuable in themselves as process. I am not interested in constructing a building so much as in having a perspicuous view of the foundation of possible buildings. Another notion of what is yet to be built or what is yet to come. Well, thank you very much for listening to me. The Bombay panel, or the Bombay guys panel, okay with you? Okay, great. We'll start with Rahul Malhotra, Professor of Urban Design and Planning and Chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design. He is a practicing architect, an urban designer, and indeed, as we know, an educator. His firm, RMA Architects, was founded in 1990 in Bombay, and he has designed and executed projects for clients that include government and non-governmental agencies, corporate as well as private individuals and institutions. I'm going to be brief since this is not your tenure hearing. If you don't mind, I will be very selective. His writings include co-authoring the book Bombay, The Cities Within, which covers the city's urban history from the 1600s to the present. Banganga, Sacred Tank, a wonderful part of Bombay. Anchoring a City Line, a history of the city's commuter railway, and so on. A deeply impressive, deeply experienced. Great pleasure in giving you your very own Rahul Malhotra.
we should have a coffee break now. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, I think even four talks on Mumbai. I mean, my head is spinning, homie. So that was fantastic. No, thank you very much. And that was really great. And that's a great way to get us all going. And I must sort of admit that I've had very little sleep because between hearing Arjun last night and the kinds of questions and thoughts he stirred up for me, and then homie's provocations, reminding us about South Mumbai just being this little tiny bit and bringing in the scalar question. And Hashim telling me that Beirut spoke through him and that I should get Mumbai to speak through me. I went home and I deleted my PowerPoint and I started all over again. And I dug into my archives very late last night and I decided what I would do is, you know, even if disjointed, put together some thoughts which recognizing that I'm the only architect or planner on the panel, that might help connect some of the insights that might surface from this presentation, from what we will hear from our historians, social scientists, and novelist friends. I think that will help us clarify and enrich our own understanding and questions related more squarely to the question of the physical form of the city. I was also reminded when Homie made that provocation, the fact that Mumbai, the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai, doesn't have a planner or an urban designer on its rolls. There is no school of urban design or urban planning in Mumbai. And so we are squarely in what I'm calling and titling this lecture, the post-planning phase of Mumbai. So what I'm going to focus on here is just, it's two parts. I'm going to share with you fragments of what I think are some questions that help us understand how the city grew. And then I'm going to just set it up as a conclusion with questions about the role of planning. And I think planning is in crisis everywhere. And I think Mumbai presents us a kind of extreme form of this condition. In Mumbai today, planning is really about incremental moves without necessarily looking for any coherent strategy or imagination of the larger form or orchestration of the city. The city has clearly moved into an era where laissez-faire as well as large-scale infrastructure development is combining to morph into a very peculiar urban landscape, a landscape that's clearly not the result of a discernible strategy or vision for the city, but rather one that has evolved out of the series of incremental moves or tactics, often played out completely independently by different constituent groups in the city. This makes for a very complex and ever-shifting set of relationships between the physical form and the artifacts, and the city, the artifact of the city, and the people that occupy this system. To start really at the beginning, and I'll do this as briefly as I can, the British really acquired Mumbai from the Portuguese, so Mumbai was not, or Bombay was not an indigenous Indian city. It was built by the British expressively for maintaining trade links with India, and was perhaps never expected to become a large town. Thus, it was never oriented or situated around a sacred place, nor was it structured in relation to the cardinal points and directions as a traditional Indian town might have been built. In fact, being primarily set up as a port, it developed looking out into the ocean with the port really as its focus. And was 7 islands. It was a factitious city, man-made, 7 islands that were welded together, again incrementally, expressing in its form really the idea of the city as a field of human enterprise. And of course this had some shortcomings because for the lack of a master plan or clear overall design resulted in a situation where the city was always ill-prepared for growth. This also offered some flexibility because for every addition or intervention was really an opportunity to compensate for deficiencies or reinforce the positive attributes of the city. So you could read this both ways. But this allowed the city to continuously renew its physical expression in response to contemporary aspirations. So a trade town, this is a painting called The Arrival of Goods After the Cold Season. A port, trade, it set up institutions, the town hall, which was set up in the 1850s, the only sort of classical building because Bombay became Gothic. And then it had some very interesting connections globally. And just out of interest here, I thought I'd point some of these out. The first was that it became a great center for shipbuilding. And Nasarwanji, a Parsi foreman and a worker of the East India Company, set up one of the greatest shipyards I think, globally at that time, and which was in Mumbai. And the Wadias built the Minden, which was launched from the Duncan docks in Mumbai on the 23rd of June, 1810. That's what you see here in the center of the painting. And it was aboard this ship that Frances Scott Key composed the American national anthem, Star Spangled Banner, while she was docked in Baltimore. And interestingly, the process of the city's development, America really features quite prominently. The second connection was ice. The first ever consignment of ice was imported from America by the firm of Jahangir Nasarvanji Wadia in September 1834. And this building, which doesn't exist there, the spherical, the spherical ice house there was where ice, it became a real node in the city because that's where ice was stored, access from the top, and it was right across from the port. In the winter of 1846, when the ice trade was at its peak, David Thoreau watched a crew of immigrant ice cutters at work in Walden Pond, and to quote a lyrical passage from his remarkable work, Walden said, "Thus it appears that the sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta drink at my well." The most significant event that had linkage with American history was a cotton boom in Mumbai. This really defined Mumbai's place, Bombay's place in a global network of cities and the global economy of the time. But more importantly, the transformations in the physical form of the city began to occur at this point. It was the American Civil War, 1861, as a result of the blockade of the ports in the southern states of America. The mills in England were unable to procure raw cotton, and the Mumbai cotton became a supplement. And it was 18 million pounds sterling that came to Mumbai to Bombay at that point as a result of this trade in a very short period of time. For that time, it was absolutely incredible. And so, as a result of that, Bombay restructured itself, and you see these great buildings, and I refer here to what Arjun was describing yesterday. That was on the footprint of the ramparts that they got the land, the new reclaimed land, on which these buildings were built. And this was perhaps the first really cohesive and great urban design gesture in all of colonial India, where these great neo-Gothic buildings fronted this Maidan, and the water right came right up to the edge of the Maidans, and as the ships came into the dock, these were posed at a decibel level for the visual level for the ships to discern. Nodes like this one with the Victoria Terminus, the Municipal Corporation building, etc. Of course, it was set up also as paraphernalia, as a setting for the army to display power. This was the station through which troops that arrived in Mumbai by port took the train on to Afghanistan and the northwest frontier. So this was really the gateway to India, and these buildings were set up at that kind of decibel level. But they always existed a dual city. This is a painting from 1865 by an unknown artist, Buleshwar. And this existed in another space with its own rules. It was another paradigm of urban development and urban form. There were different kinds of thresholds, notions of public and private space, and completely different from this world, which was Western, with its own paraphernalia. And these were two worlds that existed in two completely different spaces. So they were spatially completely segregated. Both grew incrementally. As I described, there were some gestures like what you saw with the ramparts being removed, but otherwise, as land opened up and needs occurred, the city grew. And this image captures the next phase, which you see here, and this was the large Back Bay reclamation that Homi was referring to, for those of you who are here in the discussion, as well as the kind of landscape that Arjun was describing that you traverse through. And it's a very interesting image because it shows you two styles. One is the Gothic, which was based on a kind of European classical layout, and then the Art Deco, which sort of is a modernist grid kind of pattern, which is Marine Drive at that end. But that was while it was yet under construction. So then Art Deco becomes the next phase as the new reclamation opens up. And this whole idea that every generation expresses its own aspirations through architecture as different pieces of land opened up in the city. So this was the new international modern Bombay that began to emerge at this point. The real trailblazers of the Art Deco movement, that's an image of Marine Drive, which was part of the reclamation when it was complete. And you see more models of imported cars on the road than even today. But the real trailblazers of the Art Deco movement in Mumbai were the cinemas. the most vibrant and dynamic symbols of the glamorous new lifestyle that had enveloped the city, the cinemas offered an escape to a world few Indians could afford, and moviegoers experienced uniquely modern perceptions as they were introduced to the lives socially and culturally removed from their own. Like in other places of the world, experiences fired the imagination of the city. The new cinema theaters created the greatest impact with an incredible presence in the city's landscape. Bombay possessed more than 60 cinemas by 1933 and nearly 300 by 1939. And a lot of these were strategically located at the point where you had the Indian town and the European town, because this, like the markets, became places where these two societies, in a sense, collided and entered and transgressed each other's worlds. And I think that really was a very significant moment. But then you begin to start having an incredible phenomena occur in the 60s and 70s, where for 3 decades, Mumbai added 3 million people every decade, a completely unprecedented kind of spurt in growth. And this was mind-boggling, because what really happened, spatially as a result of this, that you had a complete dissolution of the spatial segregation that otherwise existed between cultural groups. And this is a map that captures 2000, the situation in 2000, what I'm calling the temporary and the permanent city, but you have a complete kind of slippage between spatially segregated urban paradigms and cultural differences. And that is an incredible moment which begins to throw up great challenges for planning, but also it challenges our own perceptions of what the city would be, and its notion as a static, stable entity where the spectacle is architecture, and where the aspirations of the city are encoded purely in architecture, as we saw in the previous phases of the development of the city. And you begin to start having this sort of coexistence, the interstitial space. I mean, this is an image from last week, which shows that this is getting intensified even as we speak. So what does this mean? What does it do, for example, for public space? And this has been raised in other sort of presentations, but this is a comparison between public or parks, let's say public green space between Mumbai and New York. And what you see is, besides just the dearth of public space, you see its fragmentation, which is really acute, as opposed to consolidation, as you see in the diagram of New York. And of course, the statistics are really, really incredibly low. It's 0.03 per 1,000 people, and that includes the parking islands and the roundabouts. I mean, they've taken anything that looks green and kind of added it. And it's really an extreme even compared to Delhi or New York, as you see, or London. And so what this does is it creates forms of innovation and spatial practice, I think, which are very particular. And so the few open spaces like this that exist on the Maidan, which are a haven for cricket, in the evenings get converted as venues for marriages. And you see the cricket pitch, which is the sacred kind of space, is untouched. The club is, they're having high tea and samosas. The kitchen is common. The perk is that the wedding kitchen also serves the club members. And you have this kind of coexistence, a kind of docking on the space, to use what Arjun sort of described for some of our student projects. And it's a temporal articulation of the space, where the city's margins are expanded in a kind of elastic way to accommodate unimagined uses in the same space. And so this intensity of use, and in the morning it goes back to what it was. And this erasure, the temporal kind of quality of this, it even resonates in a different way, I think, some of the questions that were raised in the Detroit presentations. But for preservation, it again becomes an incredibly important question, because in a post-colonial condition, when the creators of an environment and the custodians of an environment are two different cultures, it's a much more complicated relationship in terms of preservation. And so these are the statues that were removed in the 70s when we had a right-wing government. That's when the idea of changing Bombay to Mumbai was propagated. And these British statues were all removed from public spaces, and now they line the compound of the Bombay Zoo. And that's really where they are. So they all line that area. They were just moved there, and that's Queen Victoria, and this guy's just woken up from his nap when he noticed I was photographing him. And it's a completely different relationship. And so what does it do then for preservation? And so this is the Asiatic Society, which is Our town hall used to be the town hall. It became a society library, Asiatic Society Library. There was a tradition that the governor, the British governor, went and spoke to the subjects every day, once a year. And the Indian governor, there are lots of traditions, like in Animal Farm, the pigs have taken over the master's house, so the traditions have also stayed. And our governor goes and speaks to everyone, to the citizens on the 15th of August to celebrate Independence Day. And 15th of August is in the thick of the monsoon, so it rains. So for the Public Works Department, who are challenged with making the arrangements for the governor, their challenge is how do you get the governor up there without getting him wet? And of course, the Taj group of hotels would have had two really handsome Sikhs with turbans, with umbrellas and a bugle parading him up, but the Public Works Department has other ideas. And so what they do is they actually create a covered walkway, and then they clad the building. But it's interesting, and the preservationists in the city go berserk. I mean, they're writing letters to the editor, everyone thinks it's crazy. But it's wonderful because it's totally reversible. In the morning, it's gone. And again, I think this is one of those examples of the kinetic city, where the city expands its margins. This colonial icon for our democracy has been subverted totally in the way it's clad and appropriated for our own use, but its integrity is regained from the point of view of memory and preservation. And this elasticity, I think, is an incredible phenomena. And of course, there's a whole discussion around preservation and the construction of significance. And even treating preservation and significance as a temporal phenomena can become quite an interesting debate. Of course, another example is the famous Dabbawalas, who are an informal economy, but they leverage a formal economy, again in this elastic way, to expand the margins of the city. So when you have this kind of intense spatial intermingling or layering, you have also innovation that comes out of it. And how we recognize that is quite critical. And so if I had to describe my city, I would say it's these 5 stages of squatting. The whole city is made like this, these little incremental moves that become part of the paraphernalia of the city. And they're stages of squatting. And of course, we can study it, we can deconstruct it, we can represent it, we can layer it. Here, the 5 stages of squatting, the least secure, the most secure. You can have typologies. You can do all sorts of things. And we love doing that at schools of architecture. It teaches us something, I guess, in terms of expanding the way we imagine the city. But I think at another level, it's really pathetic because it just also shows a complete failure of the operation of the city. It shows a failure of planning. It shows the failure of beginning to bring the large and the small moves and the big moves, and orchestrate them all together. In fact, these incremental tactics are now employed by a spectrum of constituent groups in the city that range from self-help housing, as I showed you, to the redevelopment of large post-industrial lands, to the creation of infrastructure. I would argue this is also incremental. Little pieces are done to solve small problems, but they're not part of a cohesive strategy for the city. And I think this reflects badly on the planning authorities, the MMRDA, which is the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, etc., which have lost their focus in terms of beginning to vision, orchestrate, strategize for the city. And I think the textile mill case, which a lot of you will be familiar with, was one of those opportunities which were completely lost to this kind of incremental move. And you continue to see that happening. This is incredible scales, but these are incremental when viewed in the context of the city. And then, of course, other crises is again a pathetic reflection, or a reflection of the pathetic kind of nature or competence of the authorities. And what's also very interesting is the idea of the city as an aesthetic, three-dimensional artifact. And so this is a report by McKinsey, which is actually driving policy in the city today. The only image in this entire report is what you see on the cover, which is an image of Marine Drive. There is no reference to amenities, and there's no reference to the visual construct of the city and its aesthetic experience at all. And you see, if you can read it, the references, it starts with referring to Shanghai as the metaphor. I mean, and that's the opening paragraph, China and Shanghai, for what is driving government policy today. It's really, really scary. And so that imagination, and I picked this up from Arjun's sort of references of context, it's very interesting. I'm just sharing these as observations. is that you either have the object or the context. The two never come together, even in the representation of what the city might look like by private enterprise. So if the context is something that won't sell, and in this case it's Chembur. For those of us who know Mumbai, Chembur, you can't breathe. People actually, everyone who lives there has asthma. The context is erased and the object is highlighted. And the context has been made into a park. It's actually got chemical factories around this site, if you key down to the thing. And similarly here, I doubt in Santa Cruz, in this location near the station, you can ever wake up to happiness. But the context is completely erased here, and the object is highlighted. On the other hand, when the context is dramatic, the object disappears. So here, what you see as buildings down there are the catalog of the Raheja Group's other projects. But this building, where this woman is sitting in a lap pool overlooking this incredible bay, the context is highlighted, but the object disappears. And this is a case where India Bulls, again, this is an incredible location at the foot of the sea link, but the object is just a cloud, implying you can be on cloud 9, I suppose. And the object is not discerned at all, whereas the context is highlighted. And so there's a kind of, even with private enterprise sort of driving the making of the city, the ambiguity in representing what form it will take, both with the context and the object, is left incredibly ambiguous, with only at any given time one being highlighted, depending on the condition. I don't quite know what this means. It's an observation. I'm trying to set this up for the incredible speakers after me. And so the Chief Minister's task force is exactly the same, and this is the most recent, which again has no references to imagery or amenities. And I raise amenities because social infrastructure is where we are desperately failing. So Mumbai, I mean, we were mapping, the students have, in our class, Marta especially, have mapped this as part of our analysis, and we've really, you know, I mean, we are in the post-planning phase. There is no hint that planning, as we understand as a discipline, even exists. And what is interesting is, if you look at the diagrams at the bottom there, you can see in the pre-planning it was accretive, incremental, and then in 64 you had New Bombay and you had a kind of planning semblance, and now you have a much larger region that you're dealing with as the urban area, but planning has disappeared. So as the scales have gone up, actually planning has got even more diluted. And of course this has all the details of events that lead to it. I won't get into it. And so then how does a city position itself to grapple with this explosive urbanization during a period of economic liberalization, a phase which commercial gains are not only taking precedence over everything else, but in fact are challenging and actually erasing all traditional planning processes? The term post-planning has actually been coined by the Chinese art critic called Ho Hanru, and it seems appropriate in describing the condition of Mumbai as a recuperative and a securing action. In this post-planning condition, economics and profits are the central players. They have clearly replaced traditional ideologies, social, environmental, historic, and aesthetic elements as the main driving forces behind the creation and expansion of cities. In this condition, then, citizens have to confront urgent questions of instability, indecision, changeability, and survival, while established social and urban fabrics are continuously being deconstructed and reorganized at a really alarming rate. And in this image, this is the kind of stuff that comes together, that coalesces. I mean, it's extreme forms of urban infrastructure, informal settlements, formal settlements, natural systems. They're all sort of colliding. And what you get are really unexpected visual arrangements. And I think for those of us who go back there often, every 6 weeks, the visual arrangement actually changes. It's really alarming, the pace at which it's happening at all scales. And in fact, architecture, as I said, is not even the single spectacle by which the city is represented. Festivals like Ganesh have completely taken over in the popular imagination, the kind of representation of what the city, I mean, even books, Raghubir Singh, the famous photographer, he had the Ganesh on the cover of the book, in a sense, to represent Mumbai as the prime spectacle. So in fact, looking at Mumbai over the last 4 decades, planning has largely been about rearguard action, versus avant-garde action that have traditionally led planning. The last sort of avant-garde action or experience was the planning and the strategy for New Bombay, a vision where a future was imagined on a greenfield condition, where policy, planning, infrastructure, architecture, and urban design were to lead the way. Not to just arrive on the scene after the effects of development, but to clean up the debris, but to actually lead the development. And so, I mean, I'm not getting into New Bombay. I'd be happy to discuss it at our panel. But these are images, early images of New Bombay, where the train, the infrastructure actually led the way. So today, then, with this effects of globalization and the urgency of integrating with a broader economic system, we've completely changed the priority in terms of what the governing authorities are pushing, or the people who are responsible for making the city, and their mandate is now being led by the Chamber of Commerce and by purely commercial interest. The Singapore architect William Lim describes, of course, this phenomena that has swept several Asian cities and refers to them as cities that have been Shanghaied. Here, the metaphor of Shanghai is effective because is about a city that has effectively and with great speed transformed its urban landscape to embrace global identity. And that's what I think Mumbai has also begun to engage with, sort of forgetting in that discourse that we are a democracy and there are different processes. But it's useful to look at the patterns that characterize the process of being Shanghaied. The first critical move is the radical transformation in the city's physical arrangement to make it viable for exchange and the flow of capital. The usual pattern in the global context is the introduction of highways, airports, stations, corporate hotels, convention centers, malls, as part of a necessary kit for a territory to be integrated with the global order. It can also happen in very fragmented ways, as is happening in Mumbai, or it can happen in organized ways. That's the new image of the SOM Mumbai airport, which is under construction, will be online in about a year. The problem with Mumbai is all happens very slowly, and I think that is the bigger lesson to learn. The next phase is to remain competitive, is urban regulation, inclusive protection of historic buildings, creation of parks, etc., which we've all sort of begun to do. And then planners and architects and NGOs get involved in this process in a variety of ways. They overlap, they get involved with cleanup operations. Planning agencies begin to devolve their responsibility and float global tenders, which has become also the norm in Mumbai. It's a devolution of your responsibility. And these agencies basically become middlemen in the process of privatizing the delivery system for urban amenities. And I think the third phase is usually driven by, another generation that have international networks, etc., begin to draw investments. And it's a kind of cyclic motion. And so I'm just going to run through these three images which represent the mapping of what is actually happening. And this sort of what Homi was referring to, South Bombay is a dot there. This is the region where the city is actually playing it out. So the scalar question is mind-boggling when we start talking about governance, for example. And an even interesting mapping is this one, this is the mapping we did at the Urban Design Research Institute, which shows you under the present legislation, these are all the potential sites of construction of privatization in the city. What is purple are the slums, and the Slum Redevelopment Authority is partnering with private enterprise to rehouse the slums. What you see in yellow is the Bombay Port Trust land, which is also going up for grabs. You see the special economic zones on the other side, etc. So it's amazing, and if you just, that on the metropolitan region, everything you see in white is a potential construction site in the next 10 years, all driven by private enterprise, with the government having very little control in the structure of what might happen, especially very little control on the visual arrangements that might occur on this incredibly vast landscape. So the scale here is absolutely mind-bogglingly humongous in terms of the challenge. A lot of it is about succession from the city, and that's what the gated communities, the special economic zones, etc., are about. They are about creating their own amenities and really seceding from the city for practical purposes. That also happens within the city, as in the Ambani house. It's another form of succession from the city in close sort of density and proximity. And then you have many inversions. This is one of our very popular politicians called Lalu Prasad, who had made this wonderful statement at MIT at a lecture, actually. And he says, what's happening is we are selling shoes in showrooms and food on the footpath, which is what's happening. And that's why I refer to amenities, because to find restaurants, to find I mean, not that I know it, I need it, Homi referred to it, a barber shop is almost an impossibility. There is no provision in the imagination of the city for amenities, for places that people actually use. It's residential, commercial, and the buck stops there. Infrastructure to make it happen. And I think this is very insightful in a very simple way that he actually highlights this question. Of course, this reflects, and I'm going to just end with some of these comments and also as a provocation for what's going to happen in the next sort of discussions, is the question of governance. And this is again a map that we've been doing as part of the research at the studio, where Mumbai is a dot there as the state of Maharashtra. You can see the different populations. And there's some history to this, but the chief minister of Mumbai, of Maharashtra, who also runs Mumbai and calls all the shots in Mumbai, is actually elected by the whole state, but from some small town. And what's interesting is that if you look at this, this is the urban population of all the red dots that you see, which are urban centers. If you add up everything in Maharashtra, Mumbai is yet bigger. But yet, the politician gets elected from a small constituency, runs the city, has no stake in the city, because the success of the city is not linked to his re-election. So there's a fundamental problem here about the governance structure of the city. And I think with that, I mean, there are many models that we can look at, and I look to Arjun here, maybe in the discussions, to pick up and sort of talk a little bit perhaps about this and his idea of deep democracy, which is interesting for me from the perspective of what we talk about in Mumbai, because it provokes it raises the question of the simultaneous ability to engage both with the grassroots and agencies more powerful than you, which is whether it's the World Bank or the municipal corporation or formal agencies. And I think what it sort of leads to is the question, again, squarely for professionals and for planners, what are the new paradigms of that engagement? Because you have a highly pluralistic condition in Mumbai. You have the lack of planning capacity in this sort of post-planning scenario. And how do you engage citizens, perhaps, as the resource? And of course, advocacy as a question is a very critical one. How do we train planners? How do we even engage with planning in different kind of forms, in different paradigms? And I think that idea of deep democracy evokes us to think. I mean, evokes this question that there is a huge void in terms of advocacy, which might be able to facilitate this process of the connection between the grassroots and agencies like the MMRDA, like the BMC, because technical complexity can't be jettisoned as a number of policy decisions and kinds of people, social, religious, economic groups affected by each, would probably make our public apparatus totally unworkable if all decisions were to be handled within a framework of political debate at the local level, which is what our 74th Amendment suggests. In a rapidly transforming city with pluralistic goals, aspirations, situations, the casting of policy decisions into a technical framework makes possible an operating consensus. So that's the positive. But as a consequence, the bureaucracy and a host of agencies that form the bureaucracies have often become very impersonal and alien. And that's why, polemic writing and documentary films focusing on squatter demolition, reports on the new flyovers or freeways, or for that matter of fact, the ineffective responses to the floods and the terrorist attacks, share the angry popular suspicion that misinformation has been pulled over the eyes of the ordinary, helpless people. And so this sort of mediating agency for a democracy to function becomes very, very, very critical. And I think coupled with that, I think the idea that multiple models of engagement within the city become really very critical for us as planners. And I just sort of end with this image, which I love, of the musicians on the Titanic. And I often think planning has become like this, which is often doing its own gig while the ship sinks. And I think we really need to sort of address this. And I think the failure of planning, I think, becomes an issue for me that surfaces as I mine my archives and as I thought about what had been discussed. And I think this is an issue that we need to address for Mumbai. Thank you very much.
Will you take questions?
No, afterwards we'll do it all together.
Rahul, thank you very much. I think the phrase that Bombay is being Shanghaied is actually extremely pertinent, and yet it has various levels, which I hope we will discuss. I just mentioned one or two things. I was in Shanghai in December and then in Bombay, and when I was being interviewed for various things in Shanghai, and I looked around from my hotel, there was just nothing. Everything was these huge new buildings. There was very little talk about amnesia. I mean, there was amongst the people a sense of paranoia, not amnesia, at least the ones who were sensitive to these issues. What is happening? It was as stunning for them as possible. Hardly any of the old fabric of the city remains, and where it remains, it's entirely sequestered, as many of you know. That's why when I went back to Bombay, and as I was saying yesterday, I think one of the problems about Bombay is the disjunctive existence, the survival of half-decrepit places. The first time I saw one of those decrepit buildings, like a good Parsi, I took out my shoes, I lit a little fire, put out a blanket, looked towards Persia, and thanked my ancestors in Persia and my Zoroastrian God that Bombay was many, as yet many, I think many generations behind Shanghai. And I think there's something to do in Bombay, particularly with those things I talked about yesterday, those large congested areas that Rahul showed, which are very much side by side, because in a way, there's a natural destruction of these old buildings and fabric, but what you see after seeing you, it's not so much the dynamic of destruction and construction, which is another, but construction and more construction and more construction. In Bombay now, they'll take an old villa, buy the floor space index, and attach a huge skyscraper to it. So you have these peculiar kinds of weird animals. But anyway, thank you very much. We look forward to be further shanghaied in Bombay later this afternoon. Now, our next speaker is Suketu Mehta. Now, you will remember Midnight's Children by Salman, great novel by Salman Rushdie. And you do remember, I hope you remember, that the main character, Salim Sinai, had this vast nose. And this nose was a kind of very sensitive political instrument for what was going to happen in Bombay. It was an affective knowledge. Even things he didn't know were going to happen, the nose picked it up. By the time our friend Suketu visited Bombay with a view to writing his remarkable book, Maximum City, that nose was deeply inhaling cocaine, and the city was on speed. And that's one of the great things about this book. It really gives you the sort of the rhythm, the temper of a city which is so much in transition. He moves from one part of it to another. There's no corner, no experience, no life world, no habitus that is not explored in a deeply engaging and seductive style. It's a very stylish performance and really picks up the rhythm of the city and its speedy feel. Suketu is a New York-based author of Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found. Those prizes that he didn't win. Yes, of course, you want me to mention them all, which I'm happy to do. Suketu he writes for a number of magazines. He's the associate and journals. He's the associate professor of journalism at New York University. He's working on a fascinating book he told me about a year ago on immigrant immigrant apartments, large immigrant apartments, as it was then in New York, and the remarkable conservation of various lifestyles, various economies of survival, various networks of culture that exist. And it sounded absolutely fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. 2007, he got a Guggenheim Fellowship, and Suketu was born in Calcutta raised in Bombay and New York, and we're delighted to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Homi, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Rahul, and everyone here at USC for inviting me. I like the term Bombay guys or Bombay boys. Also like the term Mumbai Mafia, which we might also be forming. There's some confusion about the name of this city. Some call it Bombay and others call it Mumbai. For me personally, there doesn't need to be a contradiction. When I'm speaking English, I call it Bombay. When I'm speaking Gujarati or Marathi, I call it Mumbai. When I'm speaking Hindi, I call it Bombay. As you travel around it, you find that there is a mapped city and an unmapped city. Mumbai exists on official paper and signs, Bombay in the ghosts of memory. But Bombay is what the taxi drivers know. If I get in a taxi and ask the driver, probably from distant Bihar, resident in the city for not longer than 5 years, to take me to Lady Lakshmibai Jagmohan Das Marg, he will scratch his head. But if I tell him to take me to Nepeansea Road, where I grew up and which no longer exists, he will take me to a specific physical street corresponding to the phantom name.
Sugata, you just caused a fair lady to almost faint when she heard that the whole of Nepeansea Road had been destroyed. Only the name has changed.
Only the name so far. It is a question Italo Calvino might ask. Which is more real, the map or the city? Is New York a city or a life-sized map of the city of New York? Let me tell you a little bit about why I call it Maximum City. On July 27, 2005, Bombay experienced the highest recorded rainfall in its history, 37 inches of rain in one day. The torrent showed up the best and the worst about the city. Hundreds of people drowned. But unlike the situation after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there was no widespread breakdown of civic order. Even though the police was absent, the crime rate did not go up. That's because Bombayites were busy helping each other. Slum dwellers went to the highway and took stranded motorists into their homes and made room for one more person in shacks, where the average occupancy is 7 adults to a room. Volunteers waded through waist-deep water to bring food to the 150,000 people stranded in the train stations. Human chains were formed to get people out of the floods. Most of the government machinery was absent, but nobody expected otherwise. Bombayites helped each other because they had lost faith in the government helping them. On a planet of city dwellers, this is how most human beings are going to live and cope in the 21st century. Why do people still live in Bombay? Every day is an assault on the individual's senses. From the time you get up, to the transport you take to go to work, to the offices you work in, to the forms of entertainment you are subjected to. The exhaust is so thick the air boils like a soup. There are too many people touching you in the trains, in the elevators, when you go home to sleep. You live in a seaside city, but the only time most people get anywhere near the sea is for an hour on Sunday evening on a filthy beach. It doesn't stop when you're asleep either, for the night brings the mosquitoes out of the malarial swamps, the thugs of the underworld to your door, and the booming loudspeakers of the parties of the rich and the festivals of the poor. Why would you want to leave your brick house in the village with its 2 mango trees and its view of small hills in the east to come here? So that someday, your eldest son can buy 2 rooms in Mira Road at the northern edges of the city. Well, it used to be the northern edges of the city. And the younger one can move beyond that to America. Your discomfort is an investment. Like ant colonies, people here will easily sacrifice their temporary pleasures for the greater progress of the family. One brother will work and support all the others, and he will gain a deep satisfaction from the fact that his nephew is taking an interest in computers and will probably go on to America. Bombay functions on such invisible networks of assistance. In a Bombay slum, there is no individual, there is only the organism. There are circles of fealty and duty within the organism, but the smallest circle is the family. there is no circle around the self. India frustrates description because everything you can say about it is true and false simultaneously. Yes, it could soon have the world's largest middle class, but it now has the world's largest underclass. And so with Bombay, everything is expanding exponentially. The call centers, the global reach of its film industry, its status as the financial gateway to India, as well as the slums, the numbers of absolutely destitute, the degradation of its infrastructure. There is an official story and an unofficial story about this city, and the difference is enormous. If the story of Bombay is that it is the financial capital of Asia, then we can demolish hundreds of acres of light industry without much scruple, because we need office space. If the story of Mumbai is that it is a collection of villages, then we will keep the mill areas low-lying, preserve the old towns in the city. The problem is that the media, print, and especially electronic, favor one kind of storytelling over the other. They are partial to stories that require big expense budgets, snazzy technology, flashy images. Some of the most elaborate fictions about the city are not found in the work of novelists, but in real estate brochures and city plans. They are a kind of science fiction, an idea of the future. Mumbai's cities, politicians and businessmen, as Rahul mentioned, have their eyes set firmly on Shanghai as a model for Mumbai. In 2003, the Maharashtra state government asked a group of professional storytellers, the management consulting firm McKinsey, to construct a narrative about the future of Mumbai. And they came up with the document that Rahul showed you, whose recommendations the government has officially adopted, Vision Mumbai, which aimed to turn Mumbai into, quote, a world-class city by 2013. As Charles Correa said about the plan, that's not a vision, that's a hallucination. McKinsey wanted to brand the city and asked for my help in this kind of branding. Then they read my book and stopped asking. Who gets to brand a city? Most of the people that come to Bombay are not coming to find Shanghai. They are coming to Mumbai, whose myth is attractive enough for them. It is the international consulting companies that have decided that Bombay must be rebranded as Shanghai. Mumbai is all about dhanda, or transaction. From the street food vendor squatting on a sidewalk, fiercely guarding his little business, to the tycoons and the dreams of acquiring Hollywood, this city understands money and has no guilt about the getting and spending of it. Bombay is a bird of gold, a Muslim man in the Jogeshwari slum, whose brother was shot dead by the police in the riots, and who lives in a shack without running water or a toilet, told me. Sone ki chidiya, a golden songbird. Try to catch it, if you can. It flies quick and sly, and you'll have to work hard to catch it, but once it's in your hand, a fabulous fortune will open up for you. But money is only one reason why anyone would still want to come here, leaving the pleasant trees and open spaces of the village, braving the crime and the bad air and water. It is a place where your caste doesn't matter, where a woman can dine alone at a restaurant without being harassed, and where you can marry the person of your choice. For the young person in an Indian village, the call of Bombay isn't just about money, it's also about freedom. In order to remain a compelling story, Bombay needs to dramatically upgrade essential civic services, roads, sewers, transport, health, security. But, as Rahul once observed to me, the nicer we make the city, the more the number of people that will want to come to live here. The greatest number of migrants to Bombay now come from the impoverished North Indian states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Bombay's problems can't be solved until Bihar's problems are. That means keeping them down on the farm, and that means that agriculture has to become viable again for the small farmer. Abolishing trade-distorting subsidies in the US and the EU would go a long way toward making, say, Indian cotton competitive with American cotton. So Bombay is at the mercy of national and international factors beyond its control. But there are steps that the Indian governments could take. There's no reason Bombay should be the capital of Maharashtra state. Shifting the state government to New Bombay across the harbour, as was originally intended, would free up large amounts of space in the congested office district of Nariman Point. Beyond that, there has to be legislation establishing a strong executive authority for the city with real decision-making power. The office of the mayor is currently no more than a figurehead. The city is run at the whim of the Chief Minister of the state of Maharashtra, and the state's interests are not necessarily those of the cities. There are smart and brave architects and planners who are attempting to work with the state government, but they're trying to reason with people who come from the villages who lack a metropolitan sensibility. Bombay needs a mayor with vision and political power to push through the enormous infrastructural projects that the city so badly needs. The city, which contributes 37% of all the taxes paid in India, gets only a small fraction of it back from the central government in the form of subsidies. Land needs to be opened up in the southeastern part of the island. Much of it is occupied by a naval and commercial port. There's no reason that the island city of Bombay needs a naval port, which could be relocated further down the coast. Efficient utilization of the eastern docklands area could alleviate the pressure. The city needs schools, parks, auditoria, public spaces. Instead, it gets luxury housing and shopping malls. The example of the mill areas in the center of the city, where 600 acres which were desperately needed for public use have instead been given over to developers, is a bad augury for the city. In all storytelling, the choice of the words used in the story is crucial. And the most freighted of all these words in the story of the city is the word slum. What is a slum? You and me don't like it, so we call it a slum. The word is loaded, overloaded, toppling. The people in the Mumbai slums have another word for it, basti, or community. A basti abounds in community spaces, in the line to the toilet, the line at the water tap, in the patches of empty ground where the kids play cricket, in front of the hundreds of little shops servicing every human need. The construction of the basti is crucial to the spirit of Mumbai that saves the city time and again through floods, riots, and terror attacks. Each room in the basti is exquisitely custom built, every detail of it, including the walls and ceilings. Each room is different and, over the decades, suited to its owner's needs. They are endlessly flexible with partitions and extra stories built according to the number of family members that live there. They are colored outside and in to their owner's taste. Look at a slum colony anywhere in the world. It is multicolored. Then look at the public housing that replaces it when it is demolished. It is monochromatic. It is also anonymous, generic, fungible, a triumph of anomy over community. There's an epic land grab underway in Bombay called the SRA, or the Slum Rehabilitation Authority scheme, under which if 70% of the residents of a slum agree to have the colony demolished in exchange for project housing built mostly by private developers, the views of the other 30% don't matter. As it was explained to me on a visit to the Jogeshwari slums, 70% is 100%. The people I knew when I was researching my book in the 90s, who were active in the riots, in the underworld, in politics, are now all in real estate. The builders distribute money to them with open hands in order to cajole or force 70% of the slum's residents to sign up. The deal between the builders and the governments is this: they get to build luxury housing for the rich if they also build replacement housing for the poor, whose houses they demolish. Each replacement flat is a maximum of 270 square feet. That's enough for a small living room and a small bedroom divided by a small kitchen. Each flat has a private bathroom. All this sounds good until you speak to the people who moved into the flats. Our Sanskriti, our culture, our values is not there in the flat system, an elderly man explained ruefully, looking around at the blocks of tower housing. The doors in the basti are always open. The doors in the flats are mostly closed. Cities all over the world are tearing down high-rise public housing. Bombay is building them in a frenzy, tens of thousands of these tower blocks. So where can we look for real solutions? We can start with the toilet. In 2007, Rahul and I were on the jury of the Urban Age project in Mumbai, to be given out to the best project in the city that had a potential to significantly affect the lives of its inhabitants, and one that might be successfully replicated in other cities around the world. We considered huge projects funded by the World Bank, by the state government, and by private developers: roads, housing estates, architectural wonders. And in the end, the jury members, who included the former mayor of Washington and the country's biggest art film actress, decided to give the Urban Age Award to a better toilet. Out of the 100-odd entries we had received, only one came handwritten in Marathi, the local language. It was a homegrown project from a group of slum dwellers. Hundreds of them shared a public toilet, which was a pretty disgusting place, as you might imagine. Because it was everybody's property, it was nobody's property. The municipal sweepers often didn't show up, and it was a site of filth and disease. It was worst for the women of the slum, who had nowhere else to go. So the slum dwellers came up with a solution. They put up a couple of rooms on top of the building housing the toilet, and made it into an educational center. They planted flowers around the toilet. The community center offered simple English and computer classes, and became a social center for the slum. To get to the community center, you had to pass the toilet, and so people started taking responsibility for the cleanliness of the toilet. Nobody wants to study computers on top of a filthy place. Now the structure was no longer just a toilet, to be resorted to only when your need was urgent. It became a place the young people of the slum started hanging out, and truly became a community center. In short order, the condition of the toilet improved dramatically as the people who used it made sure to clean up afterwards, because their neighbors and families were all around and literally on top of them. So we gave the prize and $50,000 to this group of slum dwellers who had come up with an ingenious as well as indigenous solution that needed very little investment and could be replicated in slum colonies around the world. The best moment for me came during the awards ceremony when Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, personally gave out the award on a stage in Bombay. The prize winners came in a bus from the slums to the Grand Hall, dressed in ill-fitting suits that they had rented for the occasion. When Frau Merkel gave them the check, they accepted it with grace and shook her hand. But when they encountered the petty municipal bureaucrat who was in charge of the area, they dove down as one and touched his feet in reverence. They knew who had the power to make day-to-day changes in their lives, and that wasn't the Chancellor of Germany. These people aren't victims, they're survivors. Greater Bombay has over 20 million people, and parts of the inner city have a population density of over 1 million people per square mile. How the hell do all these people live together? New York City is in a panic because it's projected that it will add 1 million people over the next 20 years. It'll go from 8 million to 9 million people. According to some estimates, Greater Bombay adds 1 million people every year. I realized when I was doing my book that the way Bombay survives is by a series of solidarity networks among the poor. The manager of Bombay's suburban railway system was once asked when the system would improve to a point where it could carry its 6 million daily passengers in comfort. Not in my lifetime, he answered. Certainly, if you commute into Bombay, you are made aware of the precise temperature of the human body as it curls around you on all sides, adjusting itself to every curve of your own. A lover's embrace was never so close. Asad bin Saif works in an institute for secularism, moving tirelessly among the slums, cataloguing numberless communal flare-ups and riots, seeing firsthand the slow destruction of the social fabric of this city. Asad is from Bhagalpur in Bihar, site not only of some of the worst communal rioting in the nation, but also of a gory incident where the police blinded a group of petty criminals with knitting needles and acid. Asad, of all people, has seen humanity at its worst. I asked him if he feels pessimistic about the human race. Not at all, he responded. Look at the hands from the trains. If you are late for work in the morning in Bombay, and you reach the station just as the train is leaving the platform, you can run up to the packed compartments, and you will find many hands stretching out to grab you on board, unfolding outwards from the train like petals. As you run alongside the train, you will be picked up and some tiny space will be made for your feet on the edge of the open doorway. The rest is up to you. You will probably have to hang on to the doorframe with your fingertips, being careful not to lean out too far lest you get decapitated by a pole placed too close to the tracks. But consider what has happened. Your fellow passengers already packed tighter than cattle are legally allowed to be. Their shirts already drenched in sweat in the badly ventilated compartment. Having stood like this for hours, retain an empathy for you. Know that your boss might yell at you or cut your pay if you miss this train, and will make space where none exists to take one more person with them. And at the moment of contact, they do not know if the hand that is reaching for theirs belongs to a Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Brahmin or untouchable, or whether you were born in this city or arrived only this morning, whether you live in Malabar Hill or Jogeshwari, whether you're from Bombay or Mumbai or New York. All they know is that you're trying to get to the city of gold, and that's enough. Come on board, they say. We'll adjust.